Hi, welcome to the first episode of Season 2 of London Lights. Our guest today is Mario Circelli. Mario is a Londoner, chair of the London Music Awards. We're having their 20th anniversary this year. He started the London Music Hall of Fame, first virtually, and then he teamed up with Mike Manuel to move into a brick and mortar building on Dundas Street, formerly the Nash Building. He has a degree in film. He's a student of music history in London, and he once produced the 6 o'clock news broadcast for a while, and has also created 2 documentaries on punk rock. Mario, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Dan, it's a real pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for doing these types of programs. We really need good community-focused content.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Seems you're everywhere these days. I open the paper, there's Mario. He's talking about a stage at the Western Fair. I open another page or see you on a TV interview about a famous bass player that recently passed away. So you're definitely the man on the move, and you're very familiar with what's going on in the London music scene. But you're not here to talk about that today. We're here to talk about your top 10 list of the greatest or most favorite musical acts to come out of London, Ontario. So I look forward to chatting with you about that.
Okay.
Now, before we start, I want to read something that I put together when the Junos were here in London, Ontario, and it'll give us kind of a background to get us started. So the Canadian Juno Awards were held in London, Ontario, Canada, of course, on March 17th, 2019. The Junos are the Canadian equivalent of the Grammy Awards, recognizing the highest achievers in Canadian music on an annual basis. When the announcement was made that London, Ontario would host the awards at the Budweiser Gardens, many Londoners scratched their heads asking, why London? London, in fact, and unbeknownst to many Londoners, has a rich musical history, making us a city worthy of hosting the Junos. Just before the Junos aired, the CBC presented a documentary titled London Calling, and that highlighted London residents and people with a close connection to London who had made definite music Hall of Famers impression on the world of songwriting, music production, performance, etc. The list included country music star Johnny Cash, 300 million album seller Guy Lombardo, sometimes referred to as Mr. New Year's Eve, and his Royal Canadians, Guess Who producer Jack Richardson, Garth Hudson of the band, country gentleman Tommy Hunter, Johnny Cash's manager Saul Holoff, and even Justin Bieber, a huge act right now in the world of music, was born here in London, Ontario. And the list goes on and on. Mario, what is it about London that has produced such great talent? Have you figured it out?
Yeah, you know what? I haven't figured it out, and when I do, I'll share it with you, and we could, it's almost like the caramel secret or something. I don't know what it is. It could be our proximity. The fact that we're in between Detroit and Toronto, and perennially tours kind of come through here because they're on their way from Detroit to Toronto, so we're exposed to some great shows. There was a period of time in the 70s when a lot of major touring acts used London, Ontario as their practice spot before launching a national tour. It could be the water, it could be something in the water of the Thames. The plain truth of the matter is that London has been a music city since the 1920s. The brothers Lombardo, headed by Gaetano, who preferred to be called Guy, who went on to form the Guy Lombardo Concert Orchestra that later became the Guy and the Royal Canadians, the Lombardos and the Royal Canadians. So there's been something special happening musically here in London going back many, many years. It's not new. We've seen it ebb and flow. We've seen it peak and wane, but there's always been something exciting happening in London when it comes to music.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you've put together this London Music Hall of Fame to give some recognition to some of these artists and others who have made this huge impact. Tell me about that. What gave you the idea and the incentive to go ahead and recognize Londoners in this way?
You know, I've always been passionate about music, and being a student of music, being passionate about music, starting to be involved in the local music scene when I was in grade 10 and 11 at South High School, and playing in bands, and then sneaking into the old Cedar Lounge, the Blue Boot, and watching 63 Monroe for the very first time. And as I said, I worked in radio, and I was a student of music, and I just absorbed as much as I could. And I would talk to some knowledgeable folks here in town, whether it was Greg Simpson or Dave O'Halloran, or people who really understood the history of music in town. And I would just consume as much of it as I could. And then being a performer, playing in bands, and getting to share a stage with some great artists in the 80s and into the 90s, I realized that some of these musicians, in my opinion, were world class, and they could be at home on any stage. And I could give you some names. It may sound gratuitous, but you know, drummers like Ted Peacock and John Knapp, and guitarists like Paul Aiken, and on and on and on. There's so many of them. I don't want to throw it out because I will miss people, but these are
Graham Lear.
Graham Lear, exactly. Well, Graham Lear did end up going on to tour the world. Hopefully we'll drill down a little bit on Graham later on. But and I became firmly convinced that there's musicians in this town who would be comfortable on a stage anywhere in the world performing with any performer, and they were world class in my opinion, and we should celebrate, share, and use their careers as an inspirational point for young kids to go on and pursue a career in music.
And is that the key reason why you want to do it? I mean, certainly you want to give recognition to these artists, but is it important to inspire young people and give them incentive to try and move ahead on this kind of thing?
Yeah, it completely is, and you know, I've also been associated with folks who work at the Music Industry Arts program at Fanshawe, mentors to me like Terry McManus, and the music program at Don Wright at Western. And let's face it, the arts have been, as we go into austerity measures, or governments look to cut back, and when they're looking to cut the education system, one of the first things they do is start to trim the arts. And it's sad to say that there are some high schools in London who don't have a music program. There are some schools in London who have only vocal and not band, or not strings, but they may have wind. And so they're cutting back, and the arts is very important. Music is very important. We need to encourage these young folks to, even if you don't have aspirations of becoming the next, as it were, Justin Bieber, just to perform, to brighten your own life and brighten someone else's life. And because music really speaks to the soul. And there, you could throw a ton of cliches at it, Dan, as you know, but music is the great connector. It's the unifier. It's the universal language, and it's very important. Music can tell you who we are. It can reflect on where we were, and it can project to where we're going. And it's so important. So yeah, we need to encourage kids to explore and play and enjoy music.
Mario, very well said. And that's especially true during this time of COVID, when so many people are dealing with mental health issues and depression, and the challenges of trying to deal with social isolation and that kind of thing. And I've got to say, I got to think that music is one of the tonics for the soul that has helped many people, including myself, through some of this. Now, we want to get to your top 10 list. We're going to take a commercial break in a few minutes. But before we do that, I want to get you into your top 10 list of your favorites, or who you think have made the biggest impact in London. And before we do that, I know there's going to be some punk rockers on that list. So just for the benefit of the audience, let me explain what punk rock is. Wikipedia describes it as a music genre that emerged in the mid-1970s, rooted in 1960s garage rock, which you and I were probably part of.
Yeah.
Punk rock bands rejected the perceived excesses of mainstream rock. They typically produced short, fast-paced songs with hard-edged melodies and singing styles that were stripped down, stripped down instrumentation, and often shouted political or anti-establishment lyrics. Punk embraces a do-it-yourself ethic where many bands self-produce their recordings and they distribute them through independent rock labels. And as you know, Mario, there have been some bands that started out as punk rockers and made it real big. I'm thinking of the Police, Blondie, U2, for example. And even Nirvana was considered a punk rock band when they started out. So let's get to your list. We'll do one or two before we take a commercial break. What can you tell me? Who's number 10 on your list, or number one, whichever way you want to start it?
What I will tell you, Dan, is you gave me a tough assignment. When I saw that, I go, top 10. I don't know if the truth of the matter is it's very difficult for me to do a top 10 list, particularly when it comes to music and local music. I would liken it to someone asking me which of my children I prefer. I love all my children equally. But what I'll do is I'll highlight 10 or so folks or bands, outfits that were worthy. There's many, and knowing, Dan, that there's many more. One of the important ones would be Johnny and the Canadians, Johnny Stevens, who was one of the first individual of color to front a band, not only in London in this area, but possibly in this entire region. They were a large outfit. Renee Strasser playing bass. They were playing rhythm and blues, really sophisticated but yet poppy material, and they were groundbreaking. And they had a minor hit on their hands that they recorded for Columbia Records in New York City, and Johnny had to overcome a lot of hurdles, and as you can imagine, the racial hurdles. And if I can take a quick minute, so Johnny Stevens, opening for the Supremes and playing in London and doing very well in this area. They were managed by the late great Saul Holliff, who also managed Johnny Cash, and in fact turned Johnny Cash's career around and straightened Cash up and made him a superstar. Yeah. And he was managing Johnny Stevens, Johnny and the Canadians, and came to them one day and said, look, we got a great opportunity in Florida. There's a promoter in Florida, loves the new song, wants to put you on a tour there. There's only one little hitch. You need to ditch your lead singer, in order to engage in this tour. And they looked at them and said, our lead singer is Johnny. We're called Johnny and the Canadians. He's our lead singer. And Saul, of course, said, look, I'm just bringing you the message. Yeah. So the band, Johnny, being a gentleman, an incredible human being, in addition to an amazing vocalist and musician, told the guys, look, I'm leaving the room. Think about it, okay, and I'll be back. So he came back into the room, said, yeah, I thought about this as well as you were thinking about it, and can I suggest this singer and maybe that singer to replace me, because I really want you guys to do the tour. And they turned to him and said, Renee Strasser turned to him and said, Johnny, this is your band. If you're not part of it, we're not going. And they turned down the tour simply because their lead singer was a black man.
It's an incredible story. Hey, that's a great story. That was number 10 on your list. We're working our way to number 1. And we have to take a quick commercial break. So hold on, viewers. We'll be right back after this little break. Okay, now we're back with Mario Circelli. We're working through his top 10 list of the greatest acts to come out of London, Ontario. Mario, of course, is the gentleman that started the London Music Hall of Fame, and he's chair of the London Music Awards. So lots of credibility here to tell us his list. So let's go to number 9. We heard about number 10. Number 9, Mario, what is it?
Let me lump a bunch together for you. The mid to the late 70s, London, Ontario had an incredible punk rock scene, very potent, very powerful, and the definition that you gave off the top, Dan, was fantastic. That's exactly what punk rock was about. DIY, stripped down, with the social political undertones in their message. And as you know, it can be very powerful. London, thanks to a gentleman by the name of Keith Whitaker, who went on to form the Demics, had a punk rock scene in the mid to late 70s that lasted about a decade, that rivaled anything that was happening in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. And of course, the Demics led the charge with that DIY mantra. They showed individuals that you can do this, you can do it yourself, you can strip it down and play your own music and have fun. And they started the whole scene. They couldn't get a gig in a typical band, so a bar or a typical venue. So they would rent art galleries and empty warehouses. And before too long, they noticed that these places were getting packed. They were packed. People were starving to see the Demics. From that scene came 63 Monroe, and one of my favorite records to come out of London, Stinking Out the Joint, which is the name that I co-opted to use for the punk rock documentary that I did, Stinking Out the Joint, which chronicled the London, Ontario punk rock scene. Stephen R. Stunning, these guys, they did it all. And they played CBGBs in New York, toured across Canada. From that whole scene came Sheep Look Up. And the definition again that you gave, Dan, was perfect. The Sheep Look Up started kind of as a punk band, but morphed into a post-punk band and eventually landed as one of the new Romantics. They toured all over North America with some of the heaviest hitters around. Also, Suffer Machine with Pogo Pete Tangretti, who was just an electrifying frontman, and their album Deprogrammed did very, very well. They put out a number of records, a number of CDs, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the UKs. And what made the UKs interesting was that they were led really by three powerful, strong, talented women. And Rose White was their lead singer with and interesting, because in punk rock, here's a lead singer who had a 4-octave range, who could belt it out from something very sultry to incorporating whistle toning in some of her songs, which is singing at an incredibly high pitch, and it worked. And the reason the UKs I think are important is because it spoke to that whole punk rock mantra of community and doing it yourself. And they embraced women. That whole movement, that whole scene embraced women in music. They weren't exclusive. They didn't approach it from the standpoint of only men can rock out. They embraced women, and these were three women: Diane McPherson, Christine DeVeber, and Rose White. They had a male drummer, the incredibly talented Steve Vachon. They were out there and they were doing it, and performed with, toured across Ontario with some pretty heavy hitter in the punk scene. So there's a grouping for you.
I think that's important, because I remember when I was learning to play guitar and I was thinking, oh, maybe I could become a pop musician somehow, or get into a band that would go somewhere. And at the time, you'd see these guitar gods, these virtuosos, Eddie Van Halen, Steve Vai, and Satriani, and you're saying, man, I got to be as good as those guys. And I would try and work on those licks. And of course, it's almost impossible to be as fast and as fluent on the guitar as they were. So it could be very discouraging. But this attitude that came from punk was that forget all that. You just take your passion, use your guitar as well as you can with the chords that you know, the licks that you know, and just do the best you can and make a statement. And I think that's the beauty of punk, and that probably inspired so many musicians to start out just with what they had, as you say, do it yourself and make something of it and make your statement. And I think that's very important in music. And, again, I keep going back to Nirvana, and there's Kurt Cobain with the cheapest type of Fender guitar you can have, his Mustang, but he pours everything he can into the music. And I think that's what attracted people to Nirvana. Okay, you're on your list, you're working it down. Let's hear who's next.
I think we've got the Country Music Association Awards coming to London shortly. London has had a powerful impact on country music. We are the home of Tommy Hunter, Canada's country gentleman. Earl Haywood, inducted into the London Music Hall of Fame last year as Canada's singing cowboy. Of course, what I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the importance of Marie Bottrell. Just an incredible voice, incredibly talented individual, nominated for 8 Junos in the course of her career. Unfortunately, she was up against a lightweight by the name of Anne Murray. So she was nominated for 8 Junos and unfortunately never won one. But Marie is an incredible story. She was on the road, writing music, performing, managing her own career at the age of 16, and toured across the country, performed all over Canada. Just an incredible songstress, and really had an impact in the Canadian country music scene, and had some influence in the US as well. So we're honored to have Marie in the London Music Hall of Fame, and she's an artist of note for certain.
And it's easy to forget the influence of somebody like Tommy Hunter. You know, just a London boy. He got his guitar lessons from my guitar teacher, Edith Hill Adams. And he lived in East London and went on to be a significant force on TV and radio and record. Hope to get him on the show someday, but I don't want to take your time. Who's next?
From there, let's move quickly into the 90s. The 90s in London was prolific. CHRW launched a couple of underground records that actually charted nationally, CHRW Underground 2 and London Underground 3. But one of the highlights of those two records, not just that they charted nationally and they really documented that period, that 90s period for London, but one of the bands that spawned from that era was the Gandharvas. And led by Paul Jago, an incredibly charismatic singer. Most of the band came together at Lucas High School. They pulled in some others from here and there. They started off as the Elevator Bugs, the Droogs, and then finally honed their craft and landed on the name Gandharvas. Kind of Jane's Addiction, this grunge style almost, but incredibly talented band. And they went on to land a record deal with Universal Music Canada and did I believe 2 records under the Universal banner, played Edgefest a couple times, toured across Canada, and did very well. A very impactful band, but coming out of a period where there was that was one of, we spoke earlier about the ebb and flow of the music scene in London, and the middle 90s was definitely a very fertile period. Bands like the Others and Julia Propeller, of course I mentioned the Gandharvas, and Adam West, who became CBC darlings, but one of the ones that stood out for me was the Gandharvas. Just stylistically, their ability to write, Paul's ability to write incredible hooks, rhythmically, polyrhythms on some of the drum tracks, and just really good stuff. So that highlighted the 90s.
The 90s were a great decade. In my opinion, the last great decade of music. Prolific artists, just honing their craft, writing songs that had melodies in them, had messages, and really reflected the time. So it was definitely a great decade. Hey, we're almost out of time. I hate to tell you that. Can you just give me quickly a rundown on who's left?
Graham Lear. Graham Lear went to Prince Charles Elementary School, Clark Road High School, started playing drums with the RCR band. By the time he was 15, had his own band called King Lear and the Playwrights, and I urge you to come to the London Music Hall of Fame. We have a picture of that band, and it is just incredible. You see this young, almost looks like a kid, surrounded by these grown men who are his side players, and that's Graham Lear and the Playwrights. But this kid could play, and how well could he play, Dan? Well, he was eventually discovered by Gino Vanelli, and went on to play and tour with Gino for about 10 years, then was scooped up by Carlos Santana, and has the distinction of being the longest tenured drummer for Santana, performed for 13 years with Carlos Santana. performed with REO Speedwagon and Paul Anka, and is now, I believe, Graham will forgive me because we become friends over the years, but I think he's 69 or 70 and still plays and has the Graham Lear Trio. And I had the pleasure of watching them perform at the Music Hall of Fame just a few weeks ago. And Dan, let me tell you, his chops are as good as ever. The guy, incredible drummer.
Mario, I hate to tell you this, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to give the last word to you. Take a minute or so. Tell me about the legacy of London music and all these great artists that we've had, and what do you see for the future?
I think the future for London is good, and not just the fact that we have an awards program, one of the only ones in Canada, the city specific, and not only because we have Canada's only city specific Music Hall of Fame, so we're chronicling and preserving the history and celebrating what's happening presently. But we also have two great schools here. The music, actually, I should say three. Music Industry Arts at Fanshawe, OIART Audio, it's a private audio production school, and of course, Western's Faculty of Music, the Don Wright Faculty of Music. So there's a lot of great things happening here. And as we said at the top, Dan, there's always been a great music scene in London. It may have ebbed and flowed, but we've been a music city since Guy Lombardo, since the 1920s. And I don't see that changing because we've got great schools. We've got some really good supports. The community tends to hang together and support each other. So I think music in this city is sounding really good for decades to come.
Well, that's 100 years of great music and
Sure.
great performances, and what a legacy London has. Hey, we're out of time, and it's unfortunate. I'm sure there's more on your list, but maybe we'll get you back for another show. Thanks for being with us today. And viewers, thank you for being with us here for London Lights. This was episode 1 for season 2. We have more great episodes coming up, so stay tuned. And we'll be right back with more shows on London Lights.